In today's episode of What is Twitter Melting Down Over Now, the creator of the games Lords of the Fallen and Lords of the Fallen has done something that is simply unacceptable. He has spoken to gamers. If you are unfamiliar with Lords of the Fallen or its sequel, Lords of the Fallen, they are dark fantasy souls-likes that fill in the solid but with some things to work out niche of people who want more. They're the sorts of games where there's not much to say that can put it above the incandescent standard that From Software has set for the genre, yet they can be mostly recommended. The first one generally feels like a much weightier version of early Dark Souls. It does not do anything too unusual, and this makes it pretty easy to pick up and enjoy. Like a reverse Bloodborne. Instead of being a high-strung Englishman with a rusty saw and pistol, you're a Gears of War football player in heavy armor. It feels like a AA game made a decade ago because that is pretty much what it is. But check it out if you like those sorts of games. The second, recent one, which shares the same name, took most of the first game and just made it a little bit better. It still has weighty combat, however it is much smoother, polished experience, and this one feels largely AAA. The jumping in the game is a bit clunky, and there's unfortunately far more platforming than a game like this should have early on. There is one pretty big sticking point that can either make or break the game. It has a very gimmicky mechanic where you use a magic lantern to switch between a light and dark world. Now, this may sound like the sort of thing that you have in a single late game dungeon in a Zelda game, but in this case though, it's a mechanic that persists through the game. It is frequently needed for exploration, finding treasures, and it's pretty much unavoidable. You revive in the Dark Realm if you perish in the light, so it acts like a second health bar, though the trade-off is that your health bar is pretty small in general compared to most other Souls-like games. And, while in the Dark Realm, it is almost like being always hollow in Dark Souls. The Shadow Realm is thus very dangerous, and it has the added danger of constantly respawning enemies whose biggest threat is often the amount of collision detection it fills the space with, making it more and more difficult to do things like dodge and maneuvering. This is a sort of mechanic that some may actually very much enjoy. It has an innovative feel to it, and it can add to the challenge of the game. However, it is also one of the things that a lot of gamers will find very annoying. Aside from that, the game has a visually beautiful dark fantasy world, so as a bit of a short review of both, solid games may have a few points of friction that can ruin the experience though. And it seems they are testing the waters for another game, not necessarily a third Lords of the Fallen, but the developer asked a question about what gamers want, type A or type B, or male and female for characters in games. Unsurprisingly, almost everyone went for male-female. And this has of course made journalists and Twitter slacktivists go absolutely ballistic with rage. There's a few reasons for that. The obvious is, of course, that their toxic ideology that denies the existence of men and women and replaces them with type A and type B, despite that being something absolutely nobody uses in the real world. This is something that is, nonetheless, very important to them. So important that almost every AAA game made in the last decade uses type A and B. Even games from other parts of the world that do not understand this sort of thing, which has prompted complaints, such as with the Dragon Quest III remake, where the developers didn't understand why the West was forcing both the gender censorship and a great deal of outfit censorship. That's a given. A key activist goal is the destruction of gender, and it is, according to them, going backwards progressively if we are able to admit that males and females exist. However, there's another thing at play here that activists and journalists have been fighting against for the last decade. The devs did something far worse. They communicated with gamers. This is extremely important to them, since they have this very lucrative consultant and journalist grift, where developers go to them for advice, to summarize what gamers want, which is what has resulted in years of AAA major flops like Concord, Forspoken, Kill the Justice League on 09, and nearly everything Ubisoft makes. They had what is called access, a way to both get information on games long before anyone else, and a way to throw their own influence behind studios to try to get changes which benefit themselves. This is why journalists and consultants constantly treat gamers as the enemy. They desire a world where developers are terrified of what journalists will do to the reputation of their studio and individual devs in that studio if developers start talking to what they consider to be the enemy. When a developer goes to the people who play and buy games, it cuts out all the power that the games media has. And when that happens, they lash out because they want the devs to know that talking to gamers instead of themselves will result in punishment. However, developers are starting to want to talk to both gamers and problematic content creators more and more, due both to a waning in journalists' authority and trust, and a diminishing fear over the toxic tactics of the activists trying to ruin every entertainment industry. So, even if you do not care in the slightest about gender options at character customization or any culture war discourse, it is an objectively good thing that developers are growing more and more willing to speak with gamers. There's some serious animosity that the video games industry has fostered for years of openly mistreating the audience, and making your audience happy as an entertainment company is sort of an absolute must for the company to do. The reason you employ anyone is to add value to the product, and community managers and activists simply do not do this. If anything, they regularly diminish value. If a CM lacks the ability to manage the community in a positive way, you need to do what you would do with any employee that cannot perform their job. Replace them with someone who can. And even studios with really good reputations can be irreparably harmed by negative actions against gamers who would buy their games that activists and community managers within their company have taken. A fairly obvious example of that is what is currently going on with Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and their community management. Whatever side you take in this, it is time to just recognize that the strategy of antagonizing gamers has not worked. The strategy of prioritizing activist journalist feedback over the audience has not worked. It is not the job of the gamer to do anything. However, gamers are happy to provide free information at a rate which no other industry gets, all for free. So you should harness this. Or you can continue to ignore it and enjoy the so-called games industry crash and the record-setting layoffs. Ultimately, the ball has always been and will continue to be in the court of the studios.